These
I've
maps
always
are
had a
wrong. This is
strange
a
hobby that
violation.
most of
Ma'am,
my
they're
friends
accurate.
never
No
really
violations.
understood.
I am the HOA
While I
president.
spent
This is
weekends
unacceptable.
scrolling through car listings or planning vacations, I spent mine studying property maps, county records, satellite images, forgotten parcels of land. Those things fascinated me. There's something strangely exciting about finding land that everyone else overlooked, especially when the price makes you wonder why no one grabbed it years ago. That's how I first found a listing. It was buried deep inside a county land auction site, the kind most people never bother checking. The description was short and unimpressive. 1,500 acres of mixed forest, low wetlands, and rough terrain. No buildings, no utilities, no improvements, just land. But the price caught my attention immediately. It was far cheaper than anything remotely close to that size should have been. At first, I assumed there had to be a catch. Maybe environmental restrictions, maybe flood zones, maybe some legal complication buried in the paperwork. Land that cheap usually came with problems. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I started digging through the county records, parcel maps, boundary lines, ownership history. The land had changed hands only a few times in the last century. Most recently, it had been held by an elderly owner who passed away a few years earlier. After that, the property sat in legal limbo until it was finally listed for auction. The more I looked, the more unusual the property seemed. The land itself stretched across a massive patch of forest and marshland just outside a well-developed suburban area. On the satellite map, the contrast was almost funny. On one side, perfect rows of identical houses with trimmed lawns and clean sidewalks. On the other side, endless trees and wild terrain. Two completely different worlds sitting right next to each other. That suburban neighborhood caught my attention too. From the layout and the entrance sign visible on the satellite view, it was clearly part of a planned community. The kind that had neat landscaping, matching mailboxes, and a homeowners association that likely had rules about everything from fence colors to holiday decorations. I had seen plenty of neighborhoods like that before, and usually they didn't love having large, undeveloped land nearby. That alone made the property more interesting. A few days later, I decided to drive out and see the area for myself. The neighborhood appeared exactly the way I expected. Clean streets, well-maintained homes, and carefully trimmed lawns that looked like they had been measured with rulers. Every house seemed to follow the same general design, just different enough to avoid looking identical. At the entrance, a large decorative sign displayed the community's name, surrounded by perfectly arranged flower beds. Classic HOA territory. I kept driving past the neighborhood entrance until the paved road slowly narrowed and curved toward the forest. Eventually, the houses disappeared behind me, replaced by tall trees and quiet stretches of land. Then I saw the dirt road. It wasn't much more than a worn path cutting through the woods, but according to the map, it ran straight into the property I had been studying. I parked the truck and stepped out. The place was quiet in a way that suburbs rarely are. Wind moving through tall trees. Birds somewhere in the distance. The faint smell of damp earth from the wetlands nearby. Standing there, it was easy to understand why most people ignored this land. It wasn't the kind of place developers usually rush to build on. Parts of it were uneven, some areas looked marshy, and large sections were covered in thick forest that would take serious effort to clear. But to me, that didn't look like a problem. It looked like potential. I spent the next hour walking along the edges of the property line, checking landmarks and comparing them with the maps I had printed earlier. Everything matched. The boundaries stretched much farther than I expected when standing there in person. 1,500 acres is hard to visualize on screen. In real life, it felt enormous. Eventually, the dirt road curved toward a small wooden bridge that crossed a narrow creek. It looked old but sturdy, with weathered rails and wooden planks that had clearly been there for decades. On the other side of that bridge, the road continued toward the suburban neighborhood I had passed earlier. I stood there for a moment studying it. The bridge didn't look like anything special, just a simple structure connecting the dirt road across the creek. But something about it caught my attention, mostly because it seemed oddly placed. Why would a private bridge sit on what appeared to be undeveloped land? At the time, I didn't think much about it. I crossed it, continued exploring for another 20 minutes, then eventually headed back toward my truck. The visit confirmed what I had already started to suspect. The land might not be perfect, but it certainly wasn't worthless. And at the auction price being offered, it felt like an opportunity that didn't appear very often. So I made a decision. Instead of overthinking every possible complication, I submitted a bid. The process moved surprisingly quickly. Within a couple of weeks, paperwork was finalized, signatures were completed, and just like that, I officially owned 1,500 acres of land that most people in the county had completely ignored. The purchase barely caused a ripple. No news articles, no curious developers, not even much attention from the nearby neighborhood. To them, nothing had really changed. The forest was still the forest. The wetlands were still the wetlands. And the quiet dirt road that passed through the trees looked exactly the same as it always had. What none of us realized at the time was that one small detail hidden inside those property boundaries was about to turn that quiet purchase into something far more complicated than anyone expected. Because sitting quietly on the edge of my new land was that old wooden bridge. Owning 1,500 acres sounds impressive when you say it out loud, but the truth is, at first, nothing about my daily life really changed. The land sat quietly where it had always been, beyond the neat rows of houses and trimmed lawns of the nearby neighborhood. Most of it remained untouched forest, just the way it had looked for decades. Still, I couldn't resist visiting it whenever I had the time. A few weeks after the purchase, I drove back out to the property early one morning. The sky was clear, and the air had that cool, calm feeling that only comes before the day fully wakes up. I parked near the dirt road again and began walking through the trees, taking my time and trying to understand the land better. When you own property that large, the first step is always the same. Learn the ground. I followed the dirt road for a while, occasionally stepping off the path to examine the terrain. Some areas were dry and solid, perfect for future projects. Others were softer wetlands that would likely stay untouched. I wasn't planning to develop the whole thing anyway. I just enjoyed the idea of owning a piece of land that big. Eventually, I reached the small wooden bridge again. The creek below, it moved slowly, barely making a sound as it slipped between the rocks and weeds along the banks. The bridge itself looked exactly as it had during my first visit, old, weathered but stable. I leaned on the wooden railing for a moment, listening to the quiet. Then I heard tires behind me. A white SUV had stopped at the far end of the bridge, blocking the narrow road. A woman stepped out and looked directly at me with the kind of expression people wear when they believe they've caught someone doing something suspicious. She walked toward me with quick, confident steps. "Excuse me," she said, her tone firm. "What exactly are you doing out here?" I straightened up and tried to keep the conversation friendly. "Just walking the property," I replied. Her eyebrows pulled together slightly. "Whose property?" "Mine," I said. For a second, she didn't respond. Then she crossed her arms. "This land belongs to the development," she said. "The homeowners association manages everything around here." I shook my head politely. "Not this part," I said. "This parcel was sold at auction a few weeks ago. I bought it." The woman studied me carefully, clearly trying to decide if I was serious. Behind her, another car had stopped near the road entrance. A man stepped out and joined us, glancing between the two of us with curiosity. "What's going on?" he asked. "This gentleman claims he owns the forest behind the neighborhood," the woman said. I shrugged slightly. "I do." The man looked surprised, but not immediately suspicious. In fact, he seemed more curious than anything else. "Really," he said, "that whole area back there? About 1,500 acres of it." He let out a quiet whistle. "Well, that's a lot of land." The woman, however, didn't seem impressed. Instead, she introduced herself. "My name is Karen Mitchell," she said. "I'm the president of the HOA board for this community." The title explained her attitude almost immediately. People in positions like that often become used to having authority over everything nearby, even things technically outside their control. "And I'm going to need to understand exactly what you plan to do with this property," she continued. I smiled slightly. "Right now, mostly explore it. That land borders our entire neighborhood," she said. "Any development or activity there could affect property values." "I understand that," I said calmly. And our community has certain standards, she continued. Noise restrictions, construction guidelines, environmental protections. I raised a hand gently. I appreciate the concern, I said, but your HOA rules don't apply to me. That was the moment her expression hardened. This neighborhood takes those standards very seriously, she said. And that's great, I replied. But my property isn't part of the HOA. For a moment, nobody spoke. The wind moved through the trees again, rustling the leaves overhead. The man who had joined us earlier shifted awkwardly. Well, he said carefully, I guess technically that's true. Karen didn't look happy about that. This road connects directly to our neighborhood entrance, she pointed out. Right, I said. So we'll need to stay informed about any plans you might have. I'll keep that in mind, I replied. The conversation ended shortly after that. Karen eventually returned to her SUV, though not before giving me one last skeptical look, as if she expected trouble in the future. The other resident nodded politely before driving away. When their vehicles disappeared down the road, the forest became quiet again. But something about that interaction stayed in my mind. It wasn't just Karen's tone. It was the assumption behind it. She had approached the conversation as if she already had authority over the situation, as if the land beyond the neighborhood boundary automatically fell under the HOA's influence. I had seen that kind of thinking before. Sometimes homeowners associations become so used to controlling small details inside their communities that they forget where their authority actually ends. And my land was very clearly outside those boundaries. Still, I knew that probably wouldn't stop them from trying. Over the next few weeks, I continued visiting the property occasionally. Each time, I noticed more curious glances from residents driving past the road entrance. Word had clearly spread through the neighborhood that someone new owned the forest behind their homes. Most people were simply curious, but every now and then, I would spot Karen's white SUV slowly passing the area, as if she were keeping an eye on things. One afternoon, while walking near the dirt road again, I noticed something interesting. Cars from the neighborhood used the road regularly. They crossed the small wooden bridge, drove through a short stretch of land, and then continued toward the main highway on the other side. At first, it seemed normal. Roads connect places. But the more I watched, the more something about it felt unusual. Because according to the maps I had studied earlier, that entire stretch of land, including the bridge, sat inside the boundaries of my property. At the time, I assumed there must be some kind of legal access agreement in place. An easement, most likely. After all, neighborhoods don't usually build access roads across private land without one. Still, the thought stuck in the back of my mind. Later that evening, when I got home, I opened the county records again, just to double check. That evening, curiosity got the better of me. I opened my laptop, pulled up the county property database again, and began reviewing the maps in more detail. At first, I was only trying to confirm something simple, that the road crossing my land had a legal easement attached to it. Most access roads do, especially when an entire neighborhood depends on them. So I zoomed in on the parcel map and located the creek where the small wooden bridge stood. The property lines were clearly marked in thin red borders that stretched across the forest, wrapping around wetlands and climbing over small hills. And right there, exactly where I remembered it, sat the bridge. Inside my property line, not on the edge, not partially overlapping, completely inside. At first, I assumed the map might just be simplified or slightly inaccurate. Property maps can sometimes leave out smaller legal details, especially things like road easements or right-of-way agreements. So I opened the next document, then the next, then another. I searched through archived deeds, road maintenance agreements, and public infrastructure records. If a neighborhood relied on that bridge to access the highway, there had to be something documented somewhere. At least, that's what I expected. But the deeper I looked, the stranger things became. There was no county maintenance agreement for the bridge, no state transportation record, no municipal infrastructure file, which meant one thing. It wasn't a public bridge. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Okay, I muttered to myself. Then it must be a private easement. That would make sense. A previous owner of the land could have allowed the road to pass through, granting permanent access rights to the neighborhood when it was first built. That kind of arrangement is extremely common. But when I searched for easement records attached to my parcel number, nothing appeared. No permanent roadway easement. No shared access agreement. Nothing. For a moment, I thought the database search might be incomplete. Some older agreements exist only in physical records stored at the county clerk's office. Still, the absence of anything digital was unusual. So I went deeper. I pulled up the ownership history for both my property and the neighboring subdivision. The neighborhood itself had been built about 25 years earlier, developed by a construction company that had since dissolved. That alone wasn't strange. Developers create communities all the time, then disappear after construction is finished. But when I looked at the original planning documents, something caught my attention. The subdivision map showed a single entrance road connecting the neighborhood to the highway. That same road, the one that crossed the wooden bridge. I studied the map carefully. The road clearly extended across the creek and directly into the land parcel I now owned. At that moment, a quiet thought began forming in the back of my mind. It was one of those thoughts that seems ridiculous at first, the kind you almost dismiss immediately. But once it appears, you can't ignore it. What if the developers never secured the legal rights they needed? I frowned and opened the scanned copy of the original subdivision approval documents. These files showed the planning stages when the neighborhood was first proposed to the county zoning board. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: drainage plans, environmental impact assessments, street layouts, lot divisions. But when I reached the page describing the road access, I paused. The developers had listed the bridge crossing as existing private roadway access. Existing. Private. That wording mattered, because it meant the road and bridge already existed before the neighborhood was built, and the developers simply used it. I scrolled further through the documents, looking for any mention of a recorded agreement with the landowner who had originally owned my property. Nothing appeared. I checked again. Still nothing. For several minutes, I sat there silently, slowly realizing what that might mean. If the bridge had existed long before the neighborhood, and the developers built their community assuming they could continue using it, but never actually recorded a legal easement, then the access road to the entire subdivision might technically still belong to the private landowner, which was now me. I rubbed my forehead and let out a quiet laugh. No way, I said under my breath. It sounded too strange to be true. Entire neighborhoods don't accidentally build themselves without legal access rights. That kind of mistake would be enormous. Still, I wasn't about to jump to conclusions based on online records alone. Digital archives can miss things, and property law is rarely simple. But the possibility was now sitting right in front of me. So the next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office. The building smelled faintly of old paper and dust, exactly the way government record rooms always seem to. A clerk helped me locate the archived property files connected to my parcel and the surrounding land. One by one, thick folders appeared on the table. Deeds, transfer records, survey maps, legal filings stretching back decades. I spent nearly 3 hours going through them, and by the time I finished, one fact had become very clear. The bridge was absolutely part of my property. There was no recorded easement granting the neighborhood permanent access. Not from the original landowner. Not from any later owner. Nothing. Legally speaking, that small wooden bridge and the short road leading to it belonged entirely to the land parcel I had just purchased, which meant every single resident of that neatly organized HOA neighborhood drove across my property every day without even realizing it. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the map again. Suddenly, Karen's confident tone during our conversation replayed in my mind. Our community has certain standards. I couldn't help smiling a little, because the situation had just become far more interesting than I ever expected when I first bought that quiet stretch of forest. The homeowners association believed they had control over everything around them, but they didn't realize one small detail. Their entire neighborhood depended on a bridge. For a while, I didn't tell anyone what I had discovered. The bridge situation was too strange, too complicated, and honestly too interesting to rush into. Property law can be tricky, and I wanted to be absolutely sure about everything before making any assumptions. So instead of saying anything to the neighborhood, I simply continued visiting my land the way I had before, quietly. A week later, I drove out again with a few basic tools and some wooden stakes. My plan was simple: start marking a few rough trails and possible boundary points so I could better understand the layout of the property. Nothing major, just the kind of small things any landowner might do when getting familiar with a large piece of land. The morning started peacefully enough. Sunlight filtered through the trees as I walked along the dirt road, occasionally hammering a small marker into the ground where I thought a trail might work in the future. The forest was calm. The creek moved quietly under the bridge, and for a while it felt like the entire place belonged only to the wind and the birds. Then a familiar white SUV appeared again. Karen Mitchell stepped out, closing the door a little harder than necessary. She walked straight toward me with the same determined stride I had seen during our first meeting. "We need to talk," she said. I leaned against the wooden handle of the small shovel I had been using. "Morning to you too," I replied. Her eyes moved across the stakes I had placed along the road. "What exactly are you doing out here?" "Just marking a few spots," I said, trying to get a feel for the property. She didn't look impressed. "You can't just start changing things back here." I blinked once, surprised by the statement. "I'm not changing anything," I said calmly. "I'm putting a few markers in the ground." "This land borders a residential community," she continued. "There are standards that have to be followed." I resisted the urge to sigh. "Karen," I said gently, "your HOA standards apply to homes inside the neighborhood. My land isn't part of that." She crossed her arms again. "That forest is directly behind dozens of homes," she said. "Anything you do out here affects our residents." I shrugged slightly. "Right now, the only thing I'm affecting is a few patches of dirt." She clearly didn't like that answer. "You should have contacted the HOA before starting any projects," she insisted. "Why?" "Because that's how responsible property owners behave." I paused for a moment, trying to decide how seriously to take the conversation. "I bought the land legally," I said. "I checked the zoning laws. Everything I'm doing is allowed." "That may be," she replied, "but the neighborhood board still needs to review any potential developments." I stared at her for a moment. "You don't review anything on my land," I said. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Karen's expression hardened noticeably. "We've had problems with landowners around here before," she said. "People promise they won't build anything, and then suddenly construction starts." "I'm not building anything," I said. "Yet." I almost laughed. This entire conversation was starting to feel surreal. She spoke as if the homeowners association somehow had jurisdiction over thousands of acres of land that clearly sat outside their community boundaries. But arguing about it right there beside the creek didn't seem worth the energy, so I simply nodded. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. Karen watched me for another moment before turning back toward her SUV. But the conversation didn't end there. A few days later, the first letter arrived. It came in a clean white envelope with a neighborhood association's logo printed neatly in the corner. Inside was a formal notice explaining that residents had expressed concerns about activities occurring on the land behind the community. Apparently, several homeowners had reported seeing markers, tools, and possible development signs. The letter politely requested clarification regarding my plans for the property. I wasn't too surprised. Neighborhood associations tend to take a strong interest in anything that might affect property values. Even rumors of construction can make residents nervous. Still, the tone of the letter felt a little more official than necessary. I wrote a short reply explaining that I was simply exploring my land and had no immediate development plans. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was less polite. The HOA board stated that any future construction near the community would need to comply with neighborhood aesthetic standards and environmental considerations. They also mentioned the possibility of fines if activities created disturbances for nearby homeowners. I read the letter twice before setting it down on the table. Fines from an HOA that had absolutely no authority over my property. That was when I finally decided it might be time to take things a little more seriously. I contacted a property attorney the following week and scheduled a consultation. When we sat down in his office, I explained the situation from the beginning, the land purchase, the neighborhood next door, the letters from the HOA. Then I showed him the maps, especially the one showing the bridge. He studied the documents quietly for several minutes. Then he leaned back slightly. "Well," he said slowly, "this is interesting." That word again. Interesting. I had started hearing it more and more lately. "The HOA has been sending you letters?" he asked. "Yes." "And threatening fines?" "Pretty much." He smiled faintly. "They can't do that." I figured. "But the more important question," he continued, tapping the map with his finger, "is this bridge." I nodded. "Exactly." He studied the records again, then pulled a legal database onto his computer and began searching for additional filings connected to the subdivision. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, he leaned back again. "I'm not seeing any easement agreements," he said. "That's what I found too." He folded his hands together and looked directly at me. "If these records are accurate," he said, "the homeowners association has a much bigger problem than your trail markers." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of problem?" He pointed at the small wooden bridge on the map, the kind where their entire neighborhood might technically be accessing the public highway across private property. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he added something that made the entire situation suddenly feel far more serious. "And if they've been threatening you while depending on that access." He paused. "They may have just made a very expensive mistake." After my meeting with the property attorney, I drove home with a strange mix of amusement and caution sitting in the back of my mind. The situation was starting to look far more complicated than I originally thought. When I first bought the land, it was simply a quiet investment, a huge stretch of forest that most people ignored. I never expected it to turn into some kind of legal puzzle involving an entire neighborhood. But now that possibility was sitting right in front of me. And the more I thought about it, the more important it felt to move carefully. Property disputes can get messy fast, especially when hundreds of homeowners are involved. Even if the law technically favors you, the last thing anyone wants is a long courtroom battle with a homeowners association that has access to legal funds and plenty of angry residents. So my lawyer suggested something simple. "Don't escalate," he said. "Just document everything." That meant keeping copies of every letter the HOA sent, every message, every complaint, every threat. If things ever went further, those records could become important. For a while, the situation remained quiet. I continued visiting the property occasionally, walking the trails, and studying different areas of the land. Sometimes I brought a camera or a notebook to sketch possible ideas for the future. Other times I simply walked through the woods and enjoyed the quiet. But the HOA clearly hadn't forgotten about me. A month after the second letter arrived, a third envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one was thicker and much less friendly. The document inside was labeled as a formal compliance notice from the Homeowners Association Board. It stated that multiple residents had reported unauthorized land alterations occurring near the boundary of the neighborhood. According to the letter, my activities could potentially disturb the visual harmony of the community and negatively affect nearby property values. I read that sentence twice. Visual harmony. Apparently, a few wooden stakes in the ground inside a forest were now considered a threat to suburban landscaping standards. But the letter didn't stop there. Toward the bottom of the page, the tone changed completely. The board demanded that I immediately provide written confirmation of any future plans for the land. It also stated that failure to comply with neighborhood guidelines could result in legal action. Legal action. That was the first time the HOA had used those words. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter for a moment. It wasn't just a polite request anymore. It was a threat, and that made the entire situation very different. The next morning, I scanned the document and sent a copy to my lawyer. He called me later that afternoon. "Well," he said, sounding slightly amused, "they've officially crossed a line." "That bad?" I asked. "They're threatening legal authority they don't have." "So what should I do?" "Nothing aggressive," he replied. "But it's time to respond properly." Within a few days, my lawyer drafted a formal letter addressed to the HOA board. It was calm, professional, and extremely clear. The document explained that my property sat entirely outside the homeowners association's jurisdiction. It also reminded them that any attempt to enforce HOA rules beyond their legal boundary could be considered harassment. Then came the interesting part. The letter briefly mentioned the bridge, not as a threat, just as a fact. According to county property records, the road crossing the creek was located on privately owned land, my land, and there was no recorded easement granting the subdivision permanent access. The letter didn't demand anything. It simply suggested that the HOA might want to review its own property access documentation before continuing the dispute. When I read the final draft, I had to admit something. It was beautifully subtle. The message between the lines was obvious without being aggressive. You might want to stop pushing because you're standing on very thin ground. The letter was mailed the following morning. For about a week, nothing happened. No new letters. No emails. No visits from Karen's white SUV. It was quiet again. Part of me wondered if the HOA board had taken the hint and decided to leave things alone. But that hope didn't last very long. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived. This time, the return address belonged to a law firm. Inside was a document stating that the Homeowners Association intended to pursue legal action if I continued interfering with neighborhood access roads. I blinked when I read that sentence. Interfering? I hadn't touched the road. I hadn't blocked it. I hadn't even mentioned restricting access. But the HOA's lawyer clearly believed the bridge belonged to the community, which meant something very important. They still hadn't checked the property records. They were threatening a legal fight over land they assumed they owned. I called my lawyer again and read the letter to him over the phone. He didn't speak for a few seconds. Then he chuckled. "Well," he said, "that's unfortunate. For them." I asked, "Very. What do you mean?" "They just escalated a situation they should have investigated first." I could hear papers moving on his desk. "If they file a lawsuit claiming the bridge belongs to them," he continued, "they'll have to prove it. And if they can't," he paused, "then they've just walked into a legal argument confirming that the only access road to their entire neighborhood sits on private property." I leaned back in my chair slowly. The weight of that statement settled in my mind. Because if that were true, the implications were enormous. Hundreds of families lived in that neighborhood. Every one of them relied on that road. Every morning they drove across that small wooden bridge on their way to work. Every evening they crossed it again on their way home. And none of them seemed to realize something incredibly important. That bridge had never belonged to the HOA. It had never belonged to the neighborhood. The moment the reality hit me, I realized this situation was no longer just an interesting property quirk. It had the potential to change the entire dynamic between me and the neighborhood. For weeks, the HOA had sent letters, threats, and warnings, all while completely misunderstanding one very critical fact. The bridge and the road connecting to it was mine. I spent a quiet evening reviewing the county maps and deeds again. Every time I looked at that small wooden bridge on the screen, it felt surreal. I had purchased 1,500 acres with no intention of confrontation. And yet, suddenly, I held the keys to the entire neighborhood's only access point to the outside world. The next morning, I drove out to the property, the sun rising across the treetops, casting long shadows along the dirt road. I parked near the bridge and walked across it slowly, inspecting the planks and the railing. It was old and weathered but solid. I could see tire marks from the neighborhood cars, worn into the wood over decades of use. Every car that crossed it unknowingly depended on me. For a while, I just stood there, letting the reality sink in. The wind rustled the leaves overhead, and the creek babbled quietly beneath the bridge. I imagined the residents driving home in the evening, laughing about trivial things, completely unaware that without this small bridge, their neat suburban world would be effectively isolated. Later that afternoon, I decided to take action, but subtle, careful action. I ordered a professionally printed sign, "Private property, bridge and road access controlled by owner." Nothing threatening, just a clear notice of ownership. When it arrived, I placed it carefully near the entrance of the bridge, where it would be visible but not aggressive. I watched from the trees as the first cars from the neighborhood approached. Drivers slowed slightly, reading the sign, some frowning, some curious. I didn't intervene. I wanted to see how long it would take before someone in the HOA or the residents themselves noticed the implications. Within hours, whispers began spreading through the neighborhood. One of the drivers, clearly puzzled, stopped and called a friend. That friend called another. By the next morning, it seemed like everyone had heard about the new sign. Not long after, Karen Mitchell herself arrived. Her white SUV came up the dirt road, tires crunching over loose stones. She stepped out and strode toward the bridge, scanning the sign as if it was an unfamiliar object planted overnight. Her face went pale almost immediately. You can't do this," she stammered. "I can," I said calmly. "It's my property." Her hands trembled slightly as she gestured toward the bridge. "But this road, we've always used it. The HOA, we manage this community." I shook my head. "Not this land. You manage the neighborhood, sure. But this bridge and the surrounding area? Completely outside your jurisdiction." Karen looked around, suddenly realizing something that had been invisible to her until now. The county records, the property lines, the deeds, it was all true. The bridge was mine. The only connection between the community and the highway. She had spent weeks, maybe months, sending letters and threatening me, all while the legal reality favored me completely. The reality sank in slowly. I could see her mind racing, calculating how this would affect the neighborhood. Residents relied on this access every single day. Without an easement agreement, they technically had no legal right to use the bridge. The HOA's position was shaky at best. I decided to wait before taking any further action. There was no need to rush. The knowledge alone had shifted the balance of power entirely. Suddenly, the HOA and the neighborhood had a problem they didn't know how to solve. Over the next few days, more residents drove past the sign, pausing, talking quietly to each other. I could hear rumors spreading about the new bridge owner and the legal implications. Some called the HOA office directly, demanding answers. Others tried to track me down, but I stayed careful, maintaining a low profile. Karen made several trips back to the bridge, each one marked by visible panic. She pulled out her phone repeatedly, clearly trying to consult the HOA board and legal counsel. By the end of the week, it became clear. The neighborhood leadership now fully understood the truth. The bridge was private property, legally part of my parcel, and without proper documentation, there was no legal way for them to force access. I sat on the bridge one evening, watching the last few cars of the day drive past. The sunlight glinted off the creek, and the wind rustled the leaves above me. For the first time, I felt a sense of quiet control. I hadn't done anything aggressive. I hadn't blocked anyone. I had simply asserted ownership. And yet, with one small wooden bridge, the dynamics had completely shifted. The HOA no longer held the power they assumed they had. Residents depended on me, though none of them realized it yet. The bridge reality was undeniable, and the neighborhood had no choice but to acknowledge it. I leaned back, feeling the tension of the situation mixed with a quiet sense of anticipation. The next moves were theirs, but I now held all the leverage. Sometimes I thought the smallest things carry the greatest power. And in this case, a simple wooden bridge, long overlooked, had changed everything. The next challenge was obvious: how the HOA and the residents would respond, and whether they would finally take the situation seriously before it became even messier. It didn't take long for the panic to spread. By the next morning, word of the bridge sign had reached every household in the neighborhood. Phones were ringing off the hook at the HOA office. Emails flooded the board members' inboxes. Residents demanded explanations, voicing outrage and fear. The realization that their only access to the highway rested entirely on private property owned by a newcomer hit them like a thunderbolt. Karen Mitchell was the first to appear at the bridge that morning. She arrived in her familiar white SUV, looking every bit as tense as the previous week, but far more desperate now. She stepped out, pacing back and forth, muttering under her breath. I watched quietly from a distance, curious to see how this would unfold. A few neighbors soon followed. Some had driven to the bridge themselves, ignoring the HOA's attempt to control the situation, while others had come after calling Karen, demanding clarity. Their expressions ranged from confusion to anger. A few whispered to each other, realizing that the situation wasn't just unusual. It was potentially catastrophic for the neighborhood. "What do you mean the bridge belongs to him?" one resident demanded, glaring at Karen. "We've been using that road for decades." Karen's face had drained of color. She struggled to answer, clearly unprepared for this level of scrutiny. I don't know," she stammered. "We thought it was an HOA-maintained access. It's always been used by the community." The residents weren't satisfied with that explanation. Murmurs turned into outright complaints. Some demanded that the HOA board fix this immediately. Others argued that legal action should be taken to secure permanent access. The board members began to argue among themselves, showing how little preparation they had for a situation like this. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. I hadn't intervened or made any demands. I had simply asserted ownership and let the facts speak for themselves. The effect was immediate and far more powerful than any confrontation. The board now faced the realization that they had assumed authority they didn't legally hold. By mid-morning, the phone calls and emails reached a new level of urgency. Karen and a few board members gathered to discuss a response. Their voices were tense and hurried, a mix of panic and defensiveness. They considered sending lawyers, negotiating privately, or even purchasing the land outright, but none of them had any clear plan. I remained patient, observing from a distance. Every mistake the HOA made up to this point had only strengthened my position. Their letters, threats, and attempts at control had been based on the false assumption that they had authority. Now that assumption had been exposed, and the tension among the board was palpable. Residents began talking among themselves, realizing the board had led them into this mess. Some were furious at Karen, blaming her for not securing proper access during the neighborhood's development. Others simply wanted a resolution that ensured safe passage over the bridge. The HOA's credibility was slipping rapidly, and the board knew it. The situation escalated further when a lawyer representing the HOA showed up unexpectedly, carrying documents and looking tense. He requested a private discussion with me, clearly unaware of how serious the property records already made the HOA's position. I agreed, but only in a controlled, calm manner. In the private conversation, the lawyer attempted to assert that the HOA had implied rights to the bridge, suggesting decades of use might grant them some claim. I listened carefully, letting him talk. The idea amused me. Legal theory could be argued endlessly, but property law rarely favors assumptions over documented ownership. After reviewing the facts together, it became clear they had no recorded easement, no formal agreement, and no legal standing. Their only hope would be negotiating a voluntary easement with me, and even then, I held all the leverage. I returned to the bridge, where residents were growing increasingly anxious. Karen had retreated slightly, no longer trying to assert authority in front of the crowd. The board's panic was obvious. Every resident now understood the reality. The entire neighborhood relied on a bridge they did not legally control. Calls, emails, and arguments continued throughout the day. Neighbors tried reasoning, pleading, and bargaining, but none of it changed the facts. Their access depended on a property owner who had no obligations to the HOA. The balance of power had shifted entirely. By late afternoon, it became clear the HOA needed to take the situation seriously. Board members huddled together, discussing how to secure a legal solution. Buying the bridge outright or negotiating an easement suddenly became necessary topics, not optional considerations. Their prior attempts at intimidation had only worsened the perception of incompetence and loss of control. I watched it all quietly, knowing that patience and facts had given me an undeniable advantage. The panic, the confusion, the scrambling, every misstep by the HOA strengthened my position. One overlooked bridge, one forgotten property line, had flipped decades of assumed authority completely upside down. As the sun began to set, the neighborhood remained in chaos. Board members and residents alike were forced to face a truth they had ignored for years. The bridge was not theirs, and they could no longer control access without my consent. The next step was clear. They would need to negotiate, and I would hold the terms. The HOA panic had reached its peak, and from here on, every move will be mine to shape. The neighborhood had finally realized that the small wooden bridge wasn't just a piece of infrastructure. It was the ultimate leverage, and I now held it. By the following week, the HOA board had no choice but to take the situation seriously. Meetings were scheduled frantically, often lasting late into the night. Lawyers were consulted, spreadsheets and property maps spread across conference tables, and tense discussions filled the air. The realization that their entire neighborhood's access relied on land they did not legally control had shifted the entire balance of power. For once, the HOA was scrambling, not dictating. I received a call from Karen Mitchell, the HOA president, requesting a private meeting. Her tone was noticeably more subdued than before, a stark contrast to her previous air of authority. She explained that the board wanted to negotiate a legal easement for the bridge and road. The offer was polite, careful, and respectful, as if they were stepping lightly over a minefield. When I arrived, the lawyers laid out a proposal. The HOA would pay a fair market price for a permanent easement across my land, granting residents legal, guaranteed access to the bridge and road. The terms included maintenance responsibilities, liability considerations, and long-term protection for both parties. It was structured carefully, and it was clear they wanted to resolve the matter without going to court. I listened, considering the situation. I hadn't wanted to make this adversarial. My goal was never to punish anyone. It was simply to assert ownership and ensure proper respect for property rights. But the leverage I held allowed me to shape the outcome, and I intended to use it wisely. After reviewing the terms, I negotiated a few adjustments: clarity on maintenance responsibilities, stronger liability protections for my property, and a small compensation adjustment. The board agreed quickly. They understood that pushing further would only increase legal exposure and costs. My patience, combined with the undeniable facts, had ensured a favorable outcome without confrontation. By the end of the week, the easement agreement was signed and recorded officially with the county. The bridge and the connecting road were now legally accessible to the neighborhood, with all terms documented, protecting both the HOA and my ownership rights. Residents could continue using the road without fear of disputes, and I retained full control over the surrounding land. The impact on the HOA board was immediate. Several members resigned quietly, embarrassed by their handling of the situation. Karen Mitchell stepped down from her role as president, replaced by someone with a more cautious and pragmatic approach. Residents realized that prior assumptions about authority had been dangerously misguided, and many quietly expressed relief that the situation had been resolved without a drawn-out legal battle. The neighborhood settled into a cautious calm. Drivers still used the bridge every day, but now with a small sign nearby noting the legal arrangement. I continued to visit my property regularly, exploring trails, observing wildlife, and simply enjoying the vastness of the land I owned. The bridge, once a point of potential conflict, became a symbol of careful planning and respect for property rights. Reflecting on the experience, I realized how small oversights can lead to enormous consequences. A single bridge, a few acres of land, and decades of assumed authority had. Spreadsheets and property maps spread across conference tables, and tense discussions filled the air. The realization that their entire neighborhood's access relied on land they did not legally control had shifted the entire balance of power. For once, the HOA was scrambling, not dictating. I received a call from Karen Mitchell, the HOA president, requesting a private meeting. Her tone was noticeably more subdued than before, a stark contrast to her previous air of authority. She explained that the board wanted to negotiate a legal easement for the bridge and road. The offer was polite, careful, and respectful, as if they were stepping lightly over a minefield. When I arrived, the lawyers laid out a proposal. The HOA would pay a fair market price for a permanent easement across my land, granting residents legal, guaranteed access to the bridge and road. The terms included maintenance responsibilities, liability considerations, and long-term protection for both parties. It was structured carefully, and it was clear they wanted to resolve the matter without going to court. I listened, considering the situation. I hadn't wanted to make this adversarial. My goal was never to punish anyone. It was simply to assert ownership and ensure proper respect for property rights. But the leverage I held allowed me to shape the outcome, and I intended to use it wisely. After reviewing the terms, I negotiated a few adjustments: clarity on maintenance responsibilities, stronger liability protections for my property, and a small compensation adjustment. The board agreed quickly. They understood that pushing further would only increase legal exposure and costs. My patience, combined with the undeniable facts, had ensured a favorable outcome without confrontation. By the end of the week, the easement agreement was signed and recorded officially with the county. The bridge and the connecting road were now legally accessible to the neighborhood, with all terms documented, protecting both the HOA and my ownership rights. Residents could continue using the road without fear of disputes, and I retained full control over the surrounding land. The impact on the HOA board was immediate. Several members resigned quietly, embarrassed by their handling of the situation. Karen Mitchell stepped down from her role as president, replaced by someone with a more cautious and pragmatic approach. Residents realized that prior assumptions about authority had been dangerously misguided, and many quietly expressed relief that the situation had been resolved without a drawn-out legal battle. The neighborhood settled into a cautious calm. Drivers still used the bridge every day, but now with a small sign nearby noting the legal arrangement. I continued to visit my property regularly, exploring trails, observing wildlife, and simply enjoying the vastness of the land I owned. The bridge, once a point of potential conflict, became a symbol of careful planning and respect for property rights. Reflecting on the experience, I realized how small oversights can lead to enormous consequences. A single bridge, a few acres of land, and decades of assumed authority had created a situation that could have turned chaotic. But by understanding the facts, maintaining patience, and relying on proper legal guidance, the situation was transformed into a clear, fair resolution. The HOA had learned a critical lesson. Assumptions are dangerous, and control is meaningless without legal authority. Residents learned to question what they took for granted, and I learned the power of observing quietly, letting the facts speak, and acting strategically. In the end, one overlooked bridge changed everything. What began as a quiet land purchase became a story of patience, leverage, and the careful application of rights. Ownership, I realized, is about more than titles and deeds. It's about understanding the value and power embedded in even the smallest details. And so, the 1,500 acres remained mine. The bridge remained accessible under the terms I agreed to, and the neighborhood moved forward, forever reminded that even the quietest pieces of land can hold the most unexpected power. From that day forward, I never underestimated a forgotten parcel, an old wooden bridge, or the impact that awareness, patience, and knowledge of the law can have on what seems like a simple situation. The balance of power, I had learned, is fragile, and sometimes it rests entirely on a single overlooked structure. Sometimes, the smallest things carry the greatest weight, and the quietest moves make the most dramatic difference. In my case, a bridge that most people ignored became the key to one of the most unusual and instructive experiences of my life. And for the first time, I truly appreciated the incredible potential hidden in the lands most people overlook. The story ended quietly, with the bridge standing over the creek, the forest stretching endlessly behind it, and the neighborhood finally understanding, albeit belatedly, the power of a piece of land no one had taken seriously until now.